Hello guys, welcome to Cool Coders channel. This is the channel's first YouTube video. In this channel we will talk about software development, how to implement features in your apps, and how to tackle difficulties you might face. Today's video is about social authentication with ASP.NET Core and Xamarin Forms using Xamarin Essentials. So, what we will cover today. First, we will set up social authentication with the backend and the mobile app, and we will get user information from social media, and we will add ASP.NET Core identity and generate our own JWT tokens for authentication. And while doing all of that, we will highlight and solve difficulties you might face along the way. First, we have to set up our client app on social media. In our case, we will use Facebook and Google. Then we get our client secrets and IDs and keep them somewhere safe. We go straight to setting up our redirect URLs. On Google it's quite easy. On Facebook, don't forget to set up your site URL first. Let's go and set up our redirect URLs. You will notice that by default in ASP.NET Core, for Google it ends with sign in Google, and Facebook it ends with sign in Facebook. Before diving into code, let's highlight that a few months ago, a Web Authenticator API was added to Xamarin Essentials 1.5.1, which makes it easy to implement authentication in our apps. We will use it throughout this video. First, we create a new ASP.NET Core project for the backend and add necessary NuGet packages for Facebook and Google authentication. Then we configure authentication on our project. We use cookie authentication. We then configure social authentication for Facebook first and Google. Then we use the credentials we saved earlier in our secret file. After the initial setup of the backend, let's move quickly to the mobile app. We create a new Xamarin Forms project with Xamarin Essentials, obviously. Then we set up the Web Authenticator API on each platform. Let's start with iOS. In the app delegate class, we override the openURL method with this piece of code. This method is called when the application needs to open a specified URL. Xamarin Essentials will intercept this, and in case it is the Web Authenticator URL that handles the authentication process that follows. We also set up the URL scheme. In our case, we will use the name Xamarin app as the name of the scheme. Note that the documentation suggests that you should consider using universal app links to register your app's URI as best practice. Then on Android, we create a new activity which inherits from Xamarin Essentials Web Authenticator callback activity. And we specify an action view intent. This intent is used to call back our app once authentication is made, and it returns the authentication data. We precise a data scheme, and this data scheme is unique for our app, and you should know that this data scheme should be the same everywhere across your app. It is case sensitive as specified in the documentation. We will soon use it on our backend too, so keep this in mind. We then move to the shared library where we have our auth page with two buttons, one to authenticate with Facebook and the other to authenticate with Google. When we look at the commands for these buttons, we see that the Web Authenticator API is so simple to use. All we have to do is just construct the URL for the backend and another URL with the callback scheme. Then the Web Authenticator API opens the browser and handles the redirections for us. The call is made asynchronously, as we can see, and it returns a result with the token and user information from our backend. We get this information and pass it to the user profile page. This page is now in charge of displaying the user information. If the user closes the browser before the authentication completes, a task cancellation exception is raised, and we should handle this exception in our code. The user profile view model receives the data passed during navigation and displays it on its page. We have a button on this page to test the authentication token which we received. When we press the button, it calls the API and we get the weather data. Yeah, and if the data is gotten well, then the token is valid. Let's get back to our backend and open the account controller. At this level, our code is similar to what is described in the Microsoft documentation, but we want to go further. The links are in the description. You can see our callback scheme, which is present in the mobile app too. Then we start the authentication process. This controller is called by Xamarin Essentials, passing in our case either Facebook or Google as scheme. If the user is not authenticated, we start a challenge. A redirection will occur in the browser so the user can sign into their social media account. When the user signs in successfully using claims, we get the user information available. Then we URL encode it. We then pass the URL encoded result to Xamarin Essentials, which will decode it for us and get the user information into the mobile app. Note that the access token here cannot be used to authenticate to our backend. It is gotten from the social media and we will use it later to get more user information than what we already have. Now we have a semi-working sample. We need to manage identity users, roles, and add JWT authentication. First, we add the NuGet package ASP.NET Core Identity Mongo. This package will allow us to use MongoDB instead of SQL Server for managing users. The process is the same as the normal identity for ASP.NET Core. Then we configure ASP.NET Core Identity. These configuration settings are in case you want to add email and password authentication. We set JWT authentication as the default authentication scheme. Note that in case you have both cookie and JWT authentication in your app, you could precise which authentication scheme you want to use with the above authorization attribute. We then configure JWT authentication, set the issuer, secrets, and other properties. In production, you will want to store these inside a secret location in like Azure Key Vault. Next, we get back into our mobile auth controller and we inject the sign-in manager and objects necessary for authentication. We first make a method to create the user object if it is new or to get one if the user already exists. Then we write the code to generate JWT token. First, we make a list of claims for the token. Here you can see sub stands for subject, which is unique in the scope. IAT stands for issued at, that is when the token was issued. JTI is a unique identifier for the token. Then we get our JWT secret and issuer and the expiry time. and we create our token. Now that we have methods to create and generate JWT tokens, let's use these methods in our application. After authenticating to social media, we get the user's names and email. Then we use this information to create or get an existing user. Then we generate a JWT token for this user. But what if we want to have the user's profile picture? By default in our case, we don't have this information from Google or Facebook, so we will get it ourselves. For Facebook, we will create a method which will use the access token returned by the social media. This is the access token which we talked about earlier in this video. We will use this access token to get the user's profile picture. But for Google, we will just need to add a picture claim, which will cause the user's profile picture to be sent back after authentication. We then add our user's profile picture to the information passed back down to Xamarin Essentials. After completing this, we deploy the backend and launch our mobile app. As you can see, we authenticate normally and get our access tokens. We can then use these tokens to get the wheeler from our API. This was my first video. Thank you for watching till the end. If you found this useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll be uploading more content like this. All the links are in the description. See you soon.